When a billionaire CEO's screaming baby silenced an entire five-star restaurant, nobody expected salvation to come from the invisible black waitress in the corner. But sometimes the most extraordinary gifts hide in the most overlooked places. In the marble-floored elegance of Le Bernardin's private dining room, crystal glasses trembled on white linen tablecloths as a baby's piercing cries echoed off the gold-leafed ceiling. The scent of truffle oil and aged wine hung heavy in the air, mixing with the tension that gripped every patron's shoulders. At table 7, billionaire tech CEO Jonathan Mitchell rocked his 6-month-old daughter frantically. His Armani suit wrinkled from 2 hours of failed attempts at comfort. "Sir, perhaps we should," began the maître d', his French accent strained with barely concealed irritation. "No," Mitchell snapped, sweat beading on his forehead despite the restaurant's perfect climate control. "I paid $20,000 for this private event. We're not leaving." Around the room, Manhattan's elite shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. Board members from Fortune 500 companies exchanged glances. Socialites pressed manicured fingers to their temples. The crying had started the moment they'd arrived. And nothing, not the imported pacifier, not the designer bottle, not even the professional nanny's practiced techniques had worked. In the corner, nearly invisible against the burgundy wallpaper, moved a figure in the standard black uniform of the service staff. Grace Washington carried herself with quiet dignity as she refilled water glasses, her movements fluid and purposeful. At 42, she'd learned to navigate these spaces like a ghost, seen when needed, forgotten when not. Her graying hair was pulled back in the regulation bun, and her dark eyes observed everything while appearing to notice nothing at all. Grace had worked at Le Bernardin for 8 years, serving some of the most powerful people in America. She knew their preferences, their allergies, their affairs, and their secrets. But to them, she was simply part of the furniture, reliable, efficient, and utterly unremarkable. The baby's cries intensified, a sound so desperate it seemed to claw at the very walls. Grace paused near the service station, her trained ears catching something others missed. The rhythm of the crying, the particular pitch. It wasn't just distress. It was communication in the purest form, a language older than words. "This is ridiculous," muttered Elizabeth Hartwell, the mayor's wife, to her companion. "Can't they control that child?" 20 minutes of this," whispered another guest. "I'm developing a migraine." But Grace heard something else entirely. In the baby's cries, she recognized a pattern she'd encountered before, in other places with other children. Her fingers unconsciously tapped against her serving tray, 1, 2, 3 beats. A lullaby her grandmother had sung, passed down through generations, crossing oceans and languages. She moved closer to table 7, not to intrude, but drawn by an instinct she couldn't ignore. The baby's face was red with exhaustion. Tiny fists clenched, and in that moment, Grace saw not the child of a billionaire, but simply a frightened little one far from anything familiar. Jonathan Mitchell looked up as she approached, his blue eyes wild with frustration. "What?" he demanded, his voice sharp enough to cut. Grace hesitated. She'd learned long ago that speaking out of turn, especially to men like this, rarely ended well, but the baby's cries seemed to reach into her chest, squeezing her heart. "Sir," she said softly, her voice barely audible above the crying. "Sometimes little ones just need..." "Need what?" Mitchell interrupted, bouncing the baby more aggressively. "We've tried everything. The nanny, the pediatrician, every expert money can buy." Grace's hand moved instinctively toward the child, then stopped. She knew better. She was the help. She existed to serve, not to advise. But something in the baby's eyes, a look of desperate recognition, held her transfixed. What they didn't know was that Grace Washington spoke 7 languages fluently, had studied child development at Columbia before life intervened, and had once calmed a crying infant prince in a palace on 3 continents away. And with just one gentle song, she was about to change everything they thought. They knew about the invisible woman, who'd been serving their water, because sometimes the most powerful magic comes from the most unexpected places. If this story of hidden talent and quiet dignity moves you, hit that subscribe button. We share incredible stories of overlooked heroes changing lives every week. Rate this story from 0 to 10 in the comments, and tell us about a time you witnessed someone's hidden talents being dismissed because of how they looked or where they worked. Your stories matter deeply to us, and they inspire the real-life heroes we feature next. Remember, Extraordinary gifts often hide in ordinary uniforms, and every person you encounter might be carrying wisdom you never imagined. Grace Washington had worked at Le Bernardin for exactly 8 years, 2 months and 16 days. Not that anyone had ever bothered to acknowledge her anniversary. She arrived each morning at 5:30 a.m., 45 minutes before her shift began, to iron her uniform until it was crisp, to polish her shoes until they gleamed, and to center herself for another day of being professionally invisible. The other staff members respected her work ethic, but they didn't really know her. She listened more than she spoke, smiled when appropriate, and never complained about the endless double shifts or the way certain patrons looked through her as if she were made of air. Grace had learned that survival in this world meant becoming exactly what they expected: competent, quiet, and utterly forgettable. The restaurant's elite clientele flowed past her like water around a stone. Tech moguls discussing billion-dollar mergers while she refilled their wine. Politicians planning legislation that would affect millions while she cleared their appetizer plates. Celebrities rehearsing acceptance speeches while she replaced their bread baskets. They spoke freely in her presence as if she couldn't understand their conversations about art acquisitions, yacht purchases, and private island vacations, but Grace understood everything. Every nuanced reference to European markets, every casual mention of diplomatic relations, every switch between English, French, and German that the wealthy used to maintain their exclusive conversations. She understood because she'd once moved in similar circles before everything changed. On this particular evening, Grace had been assigned to the private dining room, always a mixed blessing. The tips were better, but the attitudes were worse. These weren't just wealthy people. These were the architects of wealth itself, the ones who shaped policy from their leather chairs and decided the fate of economies over dessert courses. She'd watched Jonathan Mitchell enter with his entourage 2 hours earlier. The tech billionaire's reputation preceded him: ruthless in business, demanding in restaurants, and recently divorced with custody of his infant daughter. The baby had been calm initially, sleeping peacefully in her designer carrier while the adults discussed quarterly projections and market expansions. Grace had served their wine service, a 2005 Bordeaux that cost more than most people's monthly rent. She'd presented their amuse-bouches with the silent efficiency that had become her trademark. She'd navigated around the carrier, careful not to disturb the sleeping child. Professional in every gesture, but babies have their own schedules. And halfway through the evening, little Emma Mitchell had awakened with a vengeance. The crying had started as a gentle fuss, then escalated to full distress as the evening wore on. Grace had watched from the periphery as nanny after nanny attempted their expertise: bottles, diaper changes, temperature adjustments, white noise apps on phones. Nothing worked. The sound cut through Grace like a knife, not because it was annoying, but because it was familiar. She'd heard that exact type of cry before, in places far from Manhattan's gold-plated dining rooms. It was the cry of a child who was overwhelmed by foreign sounds, unfamiliar rhythms, alien cadences in the voices around her. As she moved through her duties, clearing plates, refilling glasses, resetting silverware, Grace found herself unconsciously humming under her breath. Old melodies surfaced from memory: a Swahili lullaby her grandmother had taught her, a French berceuse from her graduate school days, a Portuguese song she'd learned from a nanny in Sao Paulo, a Hindi melody that had soothed children in Mumbai, an Arabic tune from her time in Dubai, and Spanish verses from her childhood neighbor in Queens. The crying intensified, and Grace could see the frustration mounting in Jonathan Mitchell's face. His jaw was clenched, his movements becoming increasingly aggressive as he tried to bounce, rock, and shush his daughter. The other guests were growing visibly irritated. This wasn't the sophisticated evening they'd paid for. Grace approached with fresh water glasses, her heart aching for both the desperate father and his inconsolable child. She'd seen this dynamic before. Successful people who could control boardrooms and bend economies to their will, rendered helpless by 6 pounds of crying humanity. "Sir," she said quietly, setting down his water glass, "sometimes babies get overwhelmed by what?" Mitchell snapped, his voice cutting across the dining room. "By being in the same room as other human beings? She's 6 months old, not a delicate flower." Grace stepped back, feeling the familiar sting of dismissal. Around the table, the other guests barely looked up from their conversations. To them, the interaction was just another service interruption, the help overstepping boundaries, a billionaire putting staff in their place. But as Grace moved away, the baby's eyes tracked her movement. For just a moment, the crying subsided, and little Emma reached toward the retreating figure in the black uniform. Grace felt it, that instant connection that transcends language, culture, and social status. The recognition between souls that speaks louder than words. She paused at the service station, her back to the table, humming almost inaudibly. The melody was instinctive, chosen not by her conscious mind but by something deeper, the same instinct that had once helped her calm a feverish child in a Nairobi clinic, a homesick toddler in a Parisian nursery, a frightened baby during a monsoon in Bangkok. Behind her, the crying began to soften, just slightly. Just enough for Grace to know that Emma Mitchell wasn't just any baby throwing a tantrum. She was a child crying in the only language she knew, waiting for someone to answer in the same tongue. Deep inside, something stirred in Grace's chest, a recognition that tonight might be different. Tonight she might remember who she used to be. 20 minutes later, the tension in the private dining room had reached a breaking point. Jonathan Mitchell's face was flushed with embarrassment and rage as his daughter's cries echoed off the crystal chandeliers. The nanny he'd hired, a British woman with impeccable credentials and a salary higher than most executives, stood helplessly beside the table, her professional composure finally cracking. "Mr. Mitchell," she said, her accent strained. "Perhaps if we take her to a quieter environment." "No," Mitchell barked, his voice carrying the same tone he used to shut down board meetings. "I've invested too much in this evening to be driven out by a baby. There has to be something." Around the room, the other guests had given up any pretense of enjoying their evening. Elizabeth Hartwell was openly checking her phone, scheduling her escape. The Japanese investors at Table 3 had begun speaking in rapid, worried whispers about cultural sensitivity and appropriate responses to crying children. The mayor himself had requested the check for his table twice. Grace moved through the chaos with practiced invisibility, clearing abandoned appetizer plates and refilling water glasses that no one was drinking. But her trained eye caught details others missed. The baby's breathing pattern, the way her tiny hands opened and closed, the specific frequency of her distress calls. As she approached Table 7 again, this time to deliver fresh bread no one would eat, Grace heard Mitchell on his phone with someone, likely another expert, another solution that money could buy. "I don't care what it costs," he was saying, his free hand still bouncing the screaming baby. "Fly in from wherever you are. My daughter needs help, and you're supposedly the best pediatric sleep specialist on the East Coast." The baby's cries intensified, and without thinking, Grace softly whispered, "Hush, little one," in Swahili, "Kimya mwanangu." The effect was immediate. Emma Mitchell's cries didn't stop, but they changed, became less frantic, more searching. Her dark eyes, so much like her father's, turned toward Grace with an intensity that seemed impossible for an infant. Grace's heart skipped. She'd seen this response before, in children whose nannies spoke different languages, whose little ears had been trained to recognize comfort in multiple tongues. She took another step closer, drawn by the baby's reaction. "Mali Kibahati," she whispered even more softly. "Be patient, little gift." This time, Emma's crying decreased to a whimper. The change was subtle but unmistakable. Around the table, conversation slowed as people unconsciously strained to understand what was happening. Mitchell looked up from his phone call, his eyes narrowing as he noticed Grace standing closer than protocol typically allowed. "Excuse me," he said sharply, "but what exactly are you doing?" The entire table fell silent. Grace felt 40 pairs of eyes turned toward her, felt the familiar weight of being scrutinized by people who held her paycheck, her future, her ability to pay rent in their manicured hands. "I'm sorry, sir," she said, stepping back automatically. "I was just, the water glasses needed—" "No," Mitchell interrupted, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. "You were doing something with my daughter. What was it?" Grace's mouth went dry. She'd worked in service long enough to know this tone, this setup. She was about to be accused of overstepping, of presuming to know better than the experts, of forgetting her place. The smart thing would be to apologize, retreat, and let the evening continue its downward spiral. But Emma's whimpering turned back into full cries, and something inside Grace couldn't bear it. She seemed to respond to a different language. "Sir?" Grace said quietly, her voice barely audible over the baby's distress. Sometimes children who've heard multiple languages find comfort in different language. Mitchell's laugh was sharp and mocking. "Are you seriously suggesting that my 6-month-old daughter has language preferences? That she's somehow discriminating between English and whatever it was you were speaking?" Around the table, other guests began to pay attention. Elizabeth Hartwell's eyebrows raised in amusement. "How creative," she murmured to her companion. Dr. Harrison Webb, a prominent pediatrician who'd been dining with the investment group, cleared his throat condescendingly. "Miss," he said, his voice dripping with professional superiority, "infant cognition doesn't work that way. Babies respond to tone and rhythm, not specific languages. What you're suggesting is, well, it's not scientifically supported." Grace felt her cheeks burn, but Emma's cries seemed to reach directly into her chest. "I understand, sir. I just noticed that when I spoke in Swahili, she seemed to—" "Swahili?" Mitchell's voice cracked with disbelief. "You're telling me my daughter understands Swahili? This is ridiculous. Do you have any idea how absurd you sound?" The laughter that rippled around the table was soft but unmistakable. These were people accustomed to dismissing staff opinions, to maintaining clear boundaries between those who served and those who were served. A waitress suggesting she knew something about child development that Harvard-educated pediatricians didn't was beyond presumptuous. It was laughable. "Sir?" Grace began, but Mitchell cut her off with a wave of his hand. "Enough. I think you've overstepped quite enough for one evening. Please focus on your actual job and leave the childcare to the professionals." Grace walked away, her face burning with humiliation, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for the water pitcher. Behind her, Emma's cries reached a new level of desperation, a sound so heartbreaking that several diners actually covered their ears. But as Grace moved through the dining room, continuing her duties with professional precision, something had changed. That wasn't just embarrassment coursing through her veins. That was something else entirely, something that had been sleeping for years, finally beginning to wake up. And Emma Mitchell's eyes followed her across the room, as if recognizing something the adults couldn't see. In her one-bedroom apartment in Washington Heights, Grace sat on her threadbare couch with a photo album balanced on her lap. The leather cover was worn smooth from years of handling, and the brass corners had tarnished to a dull green. Inside, protected by yellowing plastic sleeves, was a life she'd carefully tucked away. The first photograph showed a younger Grace in academic regalia, her face radiant with achievement as she held a diploma from Columbia University, Master of Arts in International Child Development, summa cum laude. She traced the edges of the photo with one finger, remembering the weight of that moment, the pride in her parents' eyes, the sense that the world was opening up before her like a flower. The next pages chronicled a life of purpose and adventure. Grace in Mumbai, surrounded by children at a developmental clinic, their faces bright with trust and affection. Grace in Nairobi, teaching language development techniques to local healthcare workers. Grace in São Paulo, conducting research on multilingual cognitive development in infants. She'd spoken 7 languages then: English, Spanish, French, Portuguese, Swahili, Hindi, and Arabic, each one learned not from textbooks but from immersion, from necessity, from the deep desire to communicate with the children and families she served. Her research had been groundbreaking: how early exposure to multiple languages enhanced cognitive flexibility, emotional regulation, and social bonding in infants and toddlers. The Polyglot Baby Project, she whispered to herself, running her finger over a photograph of herself, presenting at an international conference in Geneva. She'd been 34 then, at the peak of her career, consulting with child development organizations across 5 continents. Her work had helped establish new protocols for multicultural childcare, had influenced policy in 12 countries, had changed how professionals understood infant communication. The last photo in the section showed Grace at her engagement party, radiant in a blue dress, her arm linked with James, tall, handsome, successful James, who'd supported her career even when it meant months apart, who'd understood that her work was a calling, not just a job. Then came the photos that hurt to look at, but which she couldn't bring herself to remove. James in the hospital bed, his skin gray with chemotherapy, his eyes still bright with love and determination. "Don't stop because of me," he'd whispered during one of their last coherent conversations. "Promise me you won't stop helping children because I'm sick." But Grace had stopped. When James needed her, when his business began to fail under the weight of medical bills, when the choice came between a research position in Geneva and staying home to hold his hand through the final months, there had been no question. Love had required sacrifice, and she had given it willingly. The medical bills had consumed everything, their savings, his business, her research grants that she'd had to forfeit when she couldn't travel. By the time James died, Grace had been unemployed for 2 years. Her research connection severed, her academic momentum lost. She'd tried to return to her field, but the development world was unforgiving to those who stepped away. Her publications were out of date. Her connections had moved on. Younger researchers had filled the positions she might once have claimed. At 40, she'd found herself overqualified for entry-level positions and underqualified for senior roles. The transition to service work had been born of desperation, not choice. Le Bernardin had been willing to hire her despite her lack of restaurant experience, perhaps because her education made her more capable of handling sophisticated clientele, perhaps because her multilingual abilities helped with international guests. She'd told herself it was temporary, a way to pay rent while she figured out her next move. 8 years later, she was still figuring. Grace turned to the final section of the album, newspaper clippings and professional articles about her old research. Revolutionary approaches to infant language development, the Washington method, multilingual comfort for distressed children, breakthrough research links, early language exposure to emotional regulation. She'd developed techniques that were still being used in pediatric wards around the world, methods for calming inconsolable infants through strategic use of different languages and cultural lullabies. Her research had proven that babies who'd been exposed to multiple languages, even in utero through their mother's exposure, retained neurological patterns that made them responsive to those sounds months or years later. Emma Mitchell's response hadn't surprised Grace. It had confirmed what she'd spent years studying, that children carried linguistic memory far deeper than most people understood. That comfort could be delivered through the careful application of culturally appropriate sounds and rhythms. But tonight, watching the dismissal in Jonathan Mitchell's eyes, hearing the condescension in Dr. Webb's voice, feeling the familiar sting of being reduced to the help, Grace had felt something crack open inside her chest. It wasn't just humiliation. It was grief. For the career she'd lost, for the children she might have helped, for the expertise that the world had forgotten she possessed. She closed the album and looked around her small apartment. The walls were bare except for one framed certificate, her Columbia diploma, the only piece of her former life she'd allowed herself to display. Everything else was packed away like dreams she'd decided were too painful to examine. But Emma Mitchell's eyes had been different. In that baby's gaze, Grace had seen recognition, not just of comfort, but of competence, of someone who understood. For the first time in years, Grace felt the stirring of something she'd thought was dead. Not just anger at being dismissed, not just frustration at being invisible, but something fiercer and more powerful. The certainty that she had knowledge the world needed, expertise that could make a difference, skills that had once changed lives across continents. She stood up, album clutched to her chest, and walked to her laptop, a battered machine she used mainly for paying bills and staying in touch with her sister. But tonight she had different plans. There it is, she whispered to herself as she opened the search browser. It was always there. She began to type. Multilingual infant comfort techniques and neurological responses to familiar languages in infants. Her fingers moved with growing confidence as she dove back into the research that had once been her life, preparing to prove that sometimes the most powerful expertise comes wrapped in the most unexpected packages. The restaurant was quieter at 11 p.m., most of the evening guests having fled the chaos of Emma Mitchell's inconsolable crying. Grace had stayed late ostensibly to help with cleanup, but really because she couldn't shake the image of that desperate baby's face. In the employee break room, she'd spent 2 hours researching on her phone, reviewing techniques she hadn't used in years, preparing for something she wasn't even sure she'd have the courage to attempt. She'd watched through the service window as the private dining room slowly emptied. Jonathan Mitchell remained at table 7 with his exhausted daughter, now joined only by his personal assistant and the increasingly frazzled British nanny. The baby had been crying for nearly 4 hours straight, a level of distress that Grace knew could be dangerous for an infant. At 11:15, Grace made a decision that would change everything. She approached the maitre d'Henri with quiet determination. "The baby in the private room," she said softly. "I have experience with pediatric care. I'd like to offer assistance." Henri's eyebrows shot up. "Grace, you cannot simply—" The gentleman was very clear about staff maintaining boundaries. "Children have died from this level of distress," Grace said, her voice steady but urgent. "Dehydration, exhaustion, respiratory issues. I have techniques that might help." Something in her tone made Henri pause. In 8 years, he'd never heard Grace speak with such authority, such professional certainty. "What kind of techniques?" "Culturally specific comfort methods, multilingual soothing protocols. I have training in this area." Before Henri could object, Grace was moving toward the private dining room. She knocked softly on the partially closed door and entered without waiting for permission. Mitchell looked up, his face haggard with exhaustion and frustration. "I thought I made it clear," he began. "Mr. Mitchell," Grace interrupted, her voice calm but firm. "Your daughter has been in distress for over 4 hours. At this level of crying, infants can develop serious medical complications. I have specialized training in multicultural pediatric comfort techniques. With your permission, I'd like to try something." The nanny stepped forward protectively. "Sir, I really don't think—" But Mitchell was staring at Grace with new attention. Something in her demeanor had changed completely. Gone was the deferential server, replaced by someone who spoke with quiet professional confidence. "What kind of training?" he asked. "I have a master's degree from Columbia in International Child Development. I've worked with pediatric distress cases across 5 continents. I've published research on multilingual comfort techniques for inconsolable infants." The words hung in the air like a revelation. Mitchell's assistant looked up from her phone in surprise. The nanny's mouth fell open slightly. "You're a waitress," Mitchell said, but his voice lacked its earlier certainty. "I'm someone who knows how to help your daughter," Grace replied. "The question is whether you'll let me try." Mitchell looked down at Emma, whose cries had grown hoarse and desperate. Her little face was red and swollen, her breathing rapid and shallow. 4 hours of professional child care expertise had failed completely. "What would you do differently?" he asked quietly. Grace approached slowly, her movements deliberate and calm. "Infants who've been exposed to multiple languages, even in utero through their mother's conversations, music, or media, retain neurological patterns that respond to those familiar sound structures. Your daughter's distress pattern suggests she's seeking specific auditory comfort that she's not finding in English alone." She paused beside the high chair where Emma continued to cry. "With your permission, I'd like to attempt comfort techniques using several languages, combined with culturally specific lullabies and rhythmic patterns that often succeed when traditional methods fail." Mitchell stared at her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Try it." Grace gently placed her hands on either side of Emma's carrier, not touching the baby but creating a calm presence. She began to hum softly, a melody that seemed to come from somewhere deep in her memory. Then, in a voice as gentle as a whisper, she began to sing. First in Swahili, "Lalam Toto, Mama Yuhapa." Emma's crying faltered slightly, her dark eyes focusing on Grace's face with sudden intensity. Then French, "Dors mon bébé, dors jusqu'au jour." The crying decreased to whimpering. Emma's tiny fists unclenched slightly. Portuguese, "Dorme meu anjo, dorme em paz." Now the baby was quiet, listening with the focused attention that only infants could give. Hindi, "Soja Rajkumari, Chandni Radhe." Emma's breathing began to slow, her body relaxing against the carrier. Arabic, "Namya Habibti, Narana Nahar." The baby's eyes began to flutter closed, exhaustion finally winning over distress. Finally Spanish, "Duérmete mi niña, que ya es hora ya." Emma Mitchell fell asleep in her carrier, her breathing deep and peaceful for the first time in hours. The silence in the room was profound. Mitchell stared at his sleeping daughter, then at Grace, his expression moving through disbelief, amazement, and something approaching awe. "How did you—" he whispered. Different languages carry different rhythmic patterns, melodic structures, and neurological triggers, Grace explained softly, careful not to wake the baby. Infants retain auditory memory of sounds they heard during critical development periods. Your daughter was likely exposed to multiple languages through media, music, or previous caregivers, and her brain was seeking those familiar comfort patterns. The nanny stepped closer, staring at the peacefully sleeping child. In 15 years of professional childcare, I've never seen anything like this. Mitchell's assistant was already typing rapidly on her phone. Sir, I'm finding multiple research papers authored by Dr. Grace Washington on exactly this topic. Columbia University, published in the Journal of International Pediatric Development, cited over 300 times. Dr. Washington, Mitchell repeated slowly, looking at Grace with entirely new eyes. Grace felt something powerful stirring in her chest. Not just satisfaction, but the remembered joy of using her expertise to help a child in need. For the first time in 8 years, she felt like herself again. Sometimes, she said quietly, the most extraordinary solutions come from the most overlooked places. Within 24 hours, everything changed. The next morning, Grace arrived at Le Bernardin for her regular shift to find Henri waiting for her with an expression she'd never seen before. Part bewilderment, part respect and complete confusion. Grace, he said, holding up his phone. There are 17 missed calls for you. From reporters, from pediatric hospitals, from university research departments, and he paused, seeming to gather himself. From Jonathan Mitchell's office. Grace felt her heart skip. She'd spent the night oscillating between elation and terror, knowing that her moment of professional assertiveness might cost her the job she desperately needed to pay rent. Am I being terminated? She asked quietly. No, Henry said, his French accent thick with amazement. You're being requested, by name, for a meeting this afternoon. The call came at noon. Mitchell's personal assistant, Sarah Chen, spoke with the crisp efficiency of someone accustomed to arranging billion-dollar deals. Dr. Washington, Mr. Mitchell would like to meet with you today at 3 p.m. Not at the restaurant. At his office. Grace's hands trembled as she changed from her server's uniform into the one professional outfit she still owned, a navy blue suit she'd worn to James's funeral, carefully pressed and paired with modest heels. She carried her old leather portfolio, the one that had once held research presentations for international conferences. The elevator to the 42nd floor of Mitchell's Manhattan headquarters felt like ascending to another world. Glass walls showcased panoramic views of Central Park. Original artwork lined hallways that hummed with quiet power. This was where decisions were made that affected millions of people, where money moved in amounts that could fund small countries. Sarah Chen escorted Grace to a conference room where Mitchell waited, but he wasn't alone. Dr. Harrison Webb sat at the polished table, the same pediatrician who'd condescendingly dismissed her the night before. Beside him sat Dr. Elena Rodriguez, whose nameplate identified her as head of pediatric development at Mount Sinai Hospital. Mitchell rose as Grace entered, his demeanor completely transformed from the desperate father she'd met 12 hours earlier. Dr. Washington, thank you for coming. Grace set her portfolio on the table and sat across from them, drawing on reserves of professional confidence she'd forgotten she possessed. How is Emma this morning? She slept 12 hours straight, Mitchell said, his voice carrying a mixture of relief and amazement. The first full night's sleep she's had in 3 months. The nanny said she woke up calm, alert, and completely different from the distressed infant we've been dealing with for weeks. Dr. Webb cleared his throat, his earlier condescension replaced by obvious discomfort. Dr. Washington, I owe you an apology. Last night I dismissed your suggestions based on assumptions about your qualifications. I've since reviewed your published research. Your work on multilingual comfort techniques is groundbreaking. Grace opened her portfolio, withdrawing copies of her research papers, her Columbia diploma, and letters of recommendation from pediatric institutions around the world. She spread them across the table with deliberate precision. I am Dr. Grace Washington, she said, her voice steady and clear. I hold a master's degree in international child development from Columbia University. I've published 43 peer-reviewed papers on multilingual pediatric comfort techniques. My research has been implemented in children's hospitals across 12 countries. I've consulted with pediatric departments from Mumbai to Sao Paulo to Nairobi. She paused, meeting each of their eyes in turn. I also happen to work as a server at Le Bernardin, because life sometimes requires us to make choices between career and love. between professional success and personal sacrifice. Dr. Rodriguez leaned forward, studying the documents. Your work on neurological responses to familiar linguistic patterns in infants. This influenced policy changes at our hospital. We've been using modified versions of your techniques for 5 years. Without knowing the original researcher was serving our wine, Mitchell added quietly. Grace felt years of suppressed professional identity flowing back into her voice. 8 years ago, I left my research position to care for my dying husband. By the time I was ready to return to the field, the academic world had moved on. My connections had disappeared. My research momentum was lost, and my savings were exhausted by medical bills. She gestured to her Navy suit, professional but clearly years old. I took a service job to survive, not because I lacked qualifications, but because sometimes brilliant people end up in unexpected places due to circumstances beyond their control. The room fell silent. Mitchell stared at the research papers spread across his conference table, then looked up at Grace with something approaching shame. Last night, you saved my daughter's sanity and probably her health, he said slowly. But more than that, you revealed something about how quickly we judge, how easily we dismiss, how completely we can overlook extraordinary talent when it doesn't appear in the package we expect. Dr. Webb nodded, his professional pride visibly struggling with his growing respect. The techniques you used last night, I've never seen results like that. In 15 years of pediatric practice, I've never witnessed such immediate, dramatic calming of a severely distressed infant. Because you've never had a child development specialist disguised as a waitress, Grace replied. The expertise was always there. You just never bothered to look beyond the uniform. Dr. Rodriguez opened a folder she'd brought with her. Dr. Washington, our pediatric department has been searching for someone with exactly your background. We've been trying to implement multilingual comfort protocols in our NICU, but we haven't found anyone with the right combination of research experience and practical application. Grace's heart began to race, but she kept her expression steady. What are you proposing? A position, Dr. Rodriguez said. Head of multicultural pediatric comfort therapy. Your own department, your own budget. The ability to train staff and develop new protocols. Mitchell leaned forward. With funding from the Mitchell Foundation, full research budget, conference travel, publication support, everything you need to continue the work you never should have had to stop. For the first time in 8 years, Grace felt tears gathering in her eyes, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming recognition that sometimes, when you help one child with dignity and expertise, the world finally remembers who you really are. 6 months later, Grace Washington stepped into the pediatric wing of Mount Sinai Hospital, wearing a white lab coat embroidered with her name and title. Dr. Grace Washington, Director of Multicultural Pediatric Comfort Therapy. The transformation from invisible waitress to recognized expert had been swift and profound. But the real validation came from what she saw around her. The new department hummed with purpose. 5 trained specialists moved between patient rooms, each fluent in multiple languages, each carrying tablets loaded with culturally specific lullabies and comfort techniques. On the walls hung certificates of appreciation from families whose children had been calmed by methods that traditional pediatric care had failed to provide. But this morning was special. The hospital's main auditorium had been reserved for Grace's first major presentation to the International Conference on Pediatric Innovation, a conference she'd once only dreamed of attending, now keynoting as the featured speaker. As she reviewed her notes one final time, Sarah Chen appeared at her office door. Mitchell's former assistant had become Grace's research coordinator, having requested the transfer after witnessing what she called the most important work happening in child development today. Dr. Washington, Sarah said, the auditorium is full, standing room only. We've got pediatric specialists from 23 countries, plus virtual attendance from 40 more institutions worldwide. Grace nodded, feeling the familiar flutter of nerves that preceded any important presentation. But this time the anxiety was mixed with something else, the deep satisfaction of returning to work that mattered, that changed lives, that used her expertise in service of children who needed it most. The Mitchell family arrived, Sarah added with a smile. Emma's walking now, and she still responds beautifully to multilingual comfort when she's upset. She's become something of a poster child for early language exposure benefits. The auditorium was indeed packed. Grace recognized faces from her graduate school days, researchers whose work she'd followed during her years in exile from academia, hospital administrators who controlled budgets for innovative programs. In the front row sat Jonathan Mitchell with Emma, now a curious toddler, and Dr. Rodriguez, who'd become not just a colleague but a friend. Grace approached the podium with the confidence that came from 6 months of proven results. Her department had successfully implemented multilingual comfort protocols that reduced infant distress by an average of 60% compared to traditional methods. 3 other hospitals had requested consultation to establish similar programs. The research papers were flowing again, published in prestigious journals, cited by institutions worldwide. 18 months ago, she began, her voice carrying clearly through the packed auditorium. I was working as a waitress, invisible to the world around me, my expertise forgotten, my voice silenced by circumstances and assumptions. The audience leaned forward, drawn by the unusual opening for an academic presentation. Tonight, I want to talk about hidden expertise, about the extraordinary knowledge that exists in unexpected places, and about what happens when we finally learn to see the people we've trained ourselves to overlook. She clicked to her first slide, a photo from that night at Le Bernardin, showing her in her server's uniform beside a clearly distraught Emma Mitchell. This is the moment everything changed, not just for one crying baby, not just for one desperate father, but for an entire approach to pediatric care that now serves children across multiple continents. The presentation unfolded with the precision she'd once brought to international conferences. She detailed the neurological research behind multilingual comfort, explained the cultural specificity of infant soothing techniques, and presented data from her department's first 6 months of operation. But more importantly, she talked about dignity, about the expertise that exists in janitors who hold engineering degrees from war-torn countries, about the nurses' aides who are trained physicians waiting for license recognition, about the service workers who carry advanced degrees but fell through economic cracks. The most profound discoveries, Grace said, clicking to a slide showing before and after distress measurements from her patients, often come from the most overlooked places. We've trained ourselves to see credentials before competence, titles before talent, positions before potential. She paused, looking out at the audience of some of the world's most respected pediatric professionals. In developing these protocols, we've discovered that 23% of hospital support staff have advanced degrees in related fields, 17% speak 3 or more languages fluently, 31% have cultural knowledge that directly impacts patient care. We've been surrounded by expertise we never bothered to recognize. The applause started slowly, from Dr. Rodriguez in the front row, but quickly spread throughout the auditorium. Grace felt the warm recognition of peers who understood the significance not just of her research, but of her journey back to professional relevance. After the presentation, the reception area buzzed with conversations about implementation, funding, and collaboration. Hospital administrators approached Grace with requests for consultation. Research colleagues she hadn't spoken to in years apologized for lost connections and expressed eagerness to collaborate. But the moment that mattered most came when Mitchell approached with Emma toddling beside him. Dr. Washington, he said, lifting his daughter into his arms, I wanted Emma to see you in your element doing the work you were meant to do. And I wanted to thank you, not just for helping her that night, but for teaching me to see people differently. Emma babbled happily and without thinking. Grace responded in gentle Swahili. Habari yako mpenzi? Emma giggled and reached toward Grace, the same recognition lighting her eyes that had started everything 18 months earlier. She remembers, Mitchell said softly. Children don't forget the people who truly see them. As Grace held Emma, watching the child's face light up with recognition and trust, she felt the full circle of her journey. From the invisible waitress dismissed by experts, to the recognized authority training the next generation of specialists, to the mentor now teaching others to look beyond uniforms and assumptions. The most important lesson, Grace said, adjusting Emma's small hand in hers, is that extraordinary gifts often come wrapped in ordinary packages, and sometimes the most powerful healing happens when we finally learn to listen to the voices we've been trained to ignore. In the applauding crowd around her, Grace saw not just professional validation, but the beginning of a movement toward recognizing hidden expertise, toward seeing dignity in unexpected places, toward understanding that sometimes the people serving your coffee might hold the keys to solving your most complex problems. 1 year later, Grace Washington still arrived at Mount Sinai at 5:30 a.m., but now she came early to review patient files and prepare her team for the day's complex cases. Her small apartment had been replaced by a comfortable home near the hospital, but she'd kept many of the same simple habits: the careful pressing of clothes, the quiet morning routine, the deep attention to dignity in all her interactions. The difference was in how the world saw her, and more importantly, how she saw herself. Every morning, she passed through the hospital's main lobby where a bronze plaque now honored the Washington Protocol for Shatter, multicultural pediatric care, techniques that had been adopted by over 200 hospitals worldwide. But Grace's greatest pride came from the young specialists she mentored, teaching them not just the technical aspects of multilingual comfort, but the deeper lesson of seeing people fully. Remember, she told her training residents during their weekly rounds, expertise lives everywhere. The maintenance worker who speaks 4 languages fluently, the cafeteria supervisor who was a teacher in her home country, the parking attendant who holds an engineering degree but needs flexibility for family caregiving. Our job is not just to provide care, but to recognize the knowledge that surrounds us. Emma Mitchell, now a bright 3-year-old, visited monthly with her father for what had become informal research sessions. She responded to comfort techniques in 6 languages now, her developing brain a living testament to the power of early multilingual exposure. More importantly, she'd become the inspiration for a scholarship program that funded multicultural pediatric training for professionals from underrepresented backgrounds. Jonathan Mitchell had transformed as well. His foundation now actively recruited expertise from unexpected places, funding programs that recognized and utilized the hidden talents of service workers, immigrants, and career change professionals. Grace taught me, he often said in interviews, that the most valuable knowledge sometimes comes from people we've been trained not to see. The ripple effects continued to spread. Henri at Le Bernardin now encouraged his staff to share their professional backgrounds and expertise, discovering that his wine steward held a master's degree in hospitality management and his sous chef had trained at the Cordon Bleu. The restaurant had become a model for recognizing and utilizing the full talents of service industry. Workers' Grace's story had been featured in medical journals, business magazines, and social justice publications, not as inspiration poverty, but as a powerful reminder that extraordinary capabilities exist in ordinary places, waiting for recognition. But perhaps the most meaningful change was in Grace herself. She'd learned to carry her expertise with quiet confidence regardless of her uniform. She understood now that her worth had never been diminished by serving tables. It had simply been overlooked by people who'd forgotten how to see. Hidden talents aren't really hidden, she often told audiences at conferences and speaking engagements. They're just waiting for someone to look beyond the surface, to listen beyond assumptions, to recognize that genius comes in every package. Sometimes the most powerful people truly are the ones nobody sees coming. And sometimes when you help one child with dignity and skill, you remind the world that extraordinary gifts are all around us, worn by people whose worth was never in question, only our ability to recognize it.